Oh, this? Yeah, it's a toothpaste. It's a cinnamon toothpaste. My bad. Hello, spooky friends, and welcome back. So often when I'm live on TikTok, we have conversations about what would you rather be, a vampire or a werewolf? Personally, I'm a werewolf kind of girl, but most of the time people express that they want to be a vampire. But what makes a vampire? And where did vampires come from? Well, vampires have been a really popular part of Hollywood. You've got Blade, you've got Akasha, Queen of the Damned, who is Ghouls. You've got Vampire Diaries, you've got Twilight, you've got the originals. The list goes on. So what exactly makes a vampire? Well, we all know that they are creatures of the night who most of the time can't come out during the day, and if they do, they sparkle.
This is always a really scary part for me. Yes! Nighttime.
Vampire legends have been around for thousands of years. They predate the Bible. In most stories, vampires are evil revenants rising from the dead, or even cursed by a witch. Either way, it's some malevolent spirit possessing a corpse, or simply just being bitten by a vampire. Belief in ancient times was so rife with vampires that it changed the way we bury our dead, and even caused public executions of people that we assumed were vampires or witches. Looking at multiple cultures, in China, you have the Jiangxi, sorry for the mispronunciation, also known as the Chinese vampire or hopping zombie, a reanimated corpse in Chinese legends and folklore. In Australia, the Yaramayahu, a legendary creature of Aboriginal mythology. According to legend, the creature resembles a little red man, a very big head, a very large mouth with no teeth, and suckers on the end of its hands and feet. That sounds kind of cute in a way. He rises at night or climbs down from a fig tree. Now I'm afraid of figs. You also have the Azurpa from India, the Jeticaca from Brazil, and in Europe you have the Ricolacus, the Dracula, and many more, all predating the Bible. One of my personal favorites that's near and dear to my heart is the Banshee of Celtic culture, a beautiful fairy with vampire-like features. In mythology, she's known as the White Woman, who lures mostly men away. She lives in the wild and only comes out at night, slitting the throat of her victim with her large talons and drinking their blood. She only wakes from the grave to feed at night. This gives to the theory that vampires are beautiful because they're very enchanting and alluring. But this way predates Bram Stoker's Dracula. There was once an essay written by a woman named Emily Gerard called Transylvania Superstitions. It classified two types of vampires in 1885. They kind of look like the Nosferatu example of the vampire. However, one, they were created as a vampire, and the other is the bitten and transformed vampire. It goes into gruesome detail, explaining exactly how to kill said vampire. Exorcisms, decapitations, and the good old stake to the heart. This was a significant influence to Bram Stoker, as you'll hear. He's got a lot of influence. The man did not make the vampire alone. Another influence was how people were prematurely buried during the cholera epidemic, and specifically in Sligo, Ireland. His mother was from Sligo, Ireland, and she used to tell him stories, often when he was sick as a child, and the epic ways that they buried their dead. A lot of people would either be dead in the grave and their bodies would move, or they would be buried alive, wake up after a fever, and then, be found alive. Then people thought they were vampires. It was a whole thing, and it happened a lot during this time. Speaking of Ireland, there's also the Abertach dwarf vampire. The story is around an undead chieftain named Abertach. He was either a dwarf or a deformed wizard who used dark magic and drank fresh human blood to sustain his energy. And as the story states, he was killed with a wooden sword. He also repeatedly rose from the grave, again, craving fresh blood to sustain him. During the 19th century, a Penny Dreadful, a really short novella or a story, came out by James Ryder and Thomas Prest called Varney the Vampire, which circulated England. In this story, it was the first time that vampires were said to have fangs instead of the talons or another way of drinking the blood, simply just killing someone. And it was the first time that they explained that a vampire would puncture the neck of someone and drink their blood, but they explained it exactly like this. A hideous gush of blood and a hideous sucking noise follows. This influenced a lot of the tropes that we see today with vampires literally drinking from the neck. There are a ton more influences coming from Europe. The Strigoi tends to be one of the more important ones. It comes from Romania and says that the Strigoi are focused on the blood of children. This comes into play a little bit later with Elizabeth Bathory, so stay with me. So they believed that they were evil souls derived from the head, and that they would wake from the grave to take children and drain them of their blood. They possess mystical attributes that you see today: supernatural strength, fear of sunlight, the ability to form some magic, and also shapeshifting. They will attack anyone, but they prefer to attack children, probably because their blood is fresher. And once a Strigoi was discovered in their grave, their body was completely destroyed beyond recognition. The first lesbian vampire was named Carmilla, introduced in a gothic novella in 1872. She was an unnatural beauty who could transform into a black cat, and this sort of gave this homosexual vibe to vampires, which is not a bad thing. It's just the first time it was introduced that way. It went from being this horrible beast to being something a little bit more sexy. And this story has many sexual scenarios and a little bit more gruesome, which made a lot of people uncomfortable. In 1510, an early Italian explorer named Pietro Anighieri, how is that for Italian? He described large, bloodlusting creatures when he was on one of his travels. He said that they were up to predatory activities and that they were lusting for men's blood. And weirdly enough, about 300 years later in the 1860s, explorer Richard Burton of England concurred with this story, and they became known as vampiros, demonic blood-sucking creatures that were bat-like.
It opened its wings like this and hovered above me, screeching, "Ah! Ha, ha, ha! Now you are vampire." And we're still friends today.
It's really evident to me that Bram Stoker did his research when he decided to come up with the concept of vampires, from his Irish experience to the rest of the world, Transylvania. He had this Nosferatu-looking kind of guy.
Peter.
He also made vampires a little bit more sexy, and then Anne Rice came in and just made it sexy as hell and a little bit gay, the best kind. Here are some allegedly true vampires from history. These stories are true, but we don't know if they were vampires. We all know about Prince Vlad Dracula, Vlad the Impaler. Over the years, many soldiers shared stories about Vlad, saying that he was bloodthirsty and obsessed with killing. He even tortured animals, which is awful, and I think that he was just like a mass murderer of some sort. He wasn't the first or the last to be a bloodthirsty killer labeled as a vampire. The Alnwick vampire predated 800 years before any accounts of Dracula. It even predates the word vampire. English historian William of Newburgh recounted the tale a priest told him. Now, this was a very devout man. He stated, a very dishonest sinner escaped custody, and he began a new life in a castle in Alnwick. It's quite complicated, but long story short, he marries a woman, then suspects her of cheating. He climbs up to the roof to check on her, and of course sees her cheating, and in his shock, he falls off the roof and dies. Unless, allegedly, it was apparent that the man had not died at all, but rather became a wandering revenant, a vampire, spreading the plague everywhere he traveled. When they decided to dig up his corpse, which happened a lot in history, so prepare yourself, it was discovered that he had bloated flesh that was warm to the touch. Why would they want to touch it like that? But whatever. Immediately, they burned his body on a pyre. They even cleansed the air to make sure that the plague didn't spread to other people. I don't really know how that works. Vampires aren't just a thing of ancient. There were some stories that came up while doing my research that were pretty damn crazy. For instance, Mineral Point, Wisconsin, 1981. Police officers are called to a graveyard. They received multiple reports of a man who was quite suspicious. People straight up said, I think there's a vampire in the graveyard and you need to check it out. But this was multiple people, and really a weird thing to happen. So Officer John Pepper decides, okay, sure, what the heck, I'll go check it out. So he goes to Graceland Cemetery. He sees this guy who straight up looks like a bloodsucker, and he kind of starts observing him. Well, I guess the bloodsucker dude noticed that he was noticing him and decided to just dip. He started to run away, so Officer Pepper gave chase, and the man jumped over a 6-foot fence. The weirdest part about that is the next day, a bunch of police officers went back to the graveyard to investigate because it was pretty weird there was no trace of the man. I forgot to mention it was winter time. There were footprints in the snow leading up to the fence, obviously running footprints. But when they looked over the fence, there were no footprints. So there was no evidence. In 1981, they dropped the case, right? Fast forward to 2004, 23 years later. People in the community forgot about this. Then it happens again. A bunch of people are calling the police station saying there's a man and he's jumping out of trees and attacking us. Please come check it out. This is like several reports. The police are like, okay, sure, we'll go ahead and we'll take a look. When they get there, the police, and keep in mind it's 23 years, there's still people from the original force, they notice that not only does the man fit the description, but he looks oddly familiar. Again, police chase this man down, and he jumps a 10-foot fence. And they say he sort of flew away. So that's it, right? Wrong. 2008. The vampire is now emboldened by being able to escape police, allegedly. I don't really know what happened. The vampire starts stalking these two people and they get freaked out and they run away. They call the police. They say a man who kind of looked vampire-y has been stalking us while we're trying to go fishing. Can you please come check it out? Police immediately go there right away. It gets weird. So the couple left everything. They left their boat, their fishing tackle, everything, and they ran to their car seconds before the vampire could reach them. I'm gonna say vampire from now on. Police investigate. Out of all of their fishing tackle, their boat, I mean hundreds of dollars worth of equipment, only one thing is missing. A flashlight. So this is weird, but I'm gonna have to eventually talk about Mineral Point because a lot of things happen. A werewolf sighting, a ghost, a Ridgeway Phantom, a haunted house. The list goes on with this town. Mineral Point, Wisconsin. Let's go visit. 1892 New England. The case of Mercy Brown is a little strange. So during the 19th century, there was a really big panic over tuberculosis. It was assumed that a lot of dead tuberculosis victims would rise from the dead and then transmit the disease to their families, which is very odd, but there are some pretty interesting explanations on that. It was thought to be a major problem, and in the case of Mercy Brown, she had passed away. Her brother then became sick with tuberculosis, so they exhumed her body just to, I guess, check it out. They exhumed her body to see if she was the cause of the issue. I know it doesn't make a lot of sense, but hey, we wore mullets in the 80s, so cool. Mercy and two other family members were exhumed at the same time, and the two other family members showed typical levels of decomposition that were expected. But Mercy, on the other hand, was really well preserved, unnaturally so. So the family did what any family would do. They carved out her heart and burned it, placed the ashes in a cup of water, and gave it to her brother Edward to drink. And he was restored too? No, he died 2 months later. Not all vampires are criminals. As Satanism and vampirism don't go hand in hand, neither does being a criminal and a vampire. There is an entire vampiric subculture of people who truly believe that they are vampires and need human blood to survive. They say that they feel healthiest when they've indulged. The person they're taking the blood from has to be a willing donor. There are also psychic vampires, which I'm sure we've all met a psychic or an energy vampire who take from willing donors, though I don't think that's always true. But that's another form of vampire in modern day. One of the most notorious vampire figures in all history is that of Elizabeth Bathory, and you probably already know about her. A Hungarian noblewoman and a ruthless killer. She is in fact one of the most prolific female, I want to say serial killers, but murderers of all time. She even made it into the Guinness Book of World Records, which I find really weird. Cool flex. It was believed that she would bathe in the blood of her young victims to restore youth and beauty. This countess was said to have more than 600 victims. And don't worry, she got hers. Because in 1614, she was sentenced to imprisonment by being bricked up into the walls of the castle and only being allowed a tiny window for food and water to be passed through. She died alone after 4 years of imprisonment. And I hope she looked old. The Lady Killer in London of 1946, also known as Neville Heath, faked many identities. One of them was a lieutenant colonel. He did this in an attempt to lure and kill women and drink their blood. He was apprehended and received capital punishment. Andrei Chikatilo, the Red Ripper, was an infamous offender in the USSR, capturing 52 women and killing them, mutilating them and drinking their blood between 1978 and 1990. Queen of the Damned in 2002 was the inspiration for Scotsman Alan Mendes, who believed he was ordered by Akasha, the queen, to kill his best friend, 21-year-old Thomas McKendrick, and drink his blood. He was convicted of murder, but he died in prison. Marcello Andante, the vampire of Nietro, believed that he had to drink the blood of young boys to keep himself beautiful, much like Bathory. He killed 14 boys in Rio de Janeiro before his conviction in 1991. He was declared mentally ill and was sentenced to a psychiatric facility. It's crazy how inspired people can be to kill and how easy. Saying that Akasha told you to kill someone is kind of ridiculous, but it's interesting that there are similarities of drinking the blood to stay alive. There are many ways to dispose of the dead, some of them prettier than others. In ancient Greece, they would boil the body in wine in order to release the evil entity or the revenant. In medieval Europe, they used iron spikes to keep the body in the grave. But there have been some really interesting discoveries, specifically in Greece. There's an island, Lesbos, was found with a metal spike through his head, his chest, and his legs. It's unexplained as to why. He seemed like just a normal worker, and there was no reason to believe during this time that there would be a vampire. So why he was disposed of this way is unknown. And oddly, he was buried in a heavy wooden coffin where others around him were not. Also, 3,000 Czech graves were found with rocks weighing bodies down. People were buried with their feet and hands in shackles. Twin vampire graves were found in Bulgaria. Both vampires were from the medieval period, and both had large metal rods driven through their chest. These are just two of the hundreds of vampire graves that have been found all over Bulgaria. In fact, vampire burials were a tradition in Bulgaria until the 1970s, and even had a designated person to carry out these burials. In 2012, in a mass grave used by a plague sanatorium in Lazaretto Nuovo, Italy, a woman's body was given a vampire burial, though the other bodies were not. A brick had been placed in her mouth to prevent her from feeding, and actually a brick in the mouth was known as an exorcism burial during this time in Italy. The rise of Christianity played such a large role in vampiric burials and the persecution of vampires throughout history. In Europe, it threw massive amounts of fuel on an already burning fire because vampires were seen as unholy. Ironic that Christianity would fear people rising from the grave. I'm just saying, Jesus. I'm not wrong. Medieval peasants were already quite superstitious, especially following the horror of the Black Plague. Poor people. So with the rise of the church becoming so powerful, these eternal superstitions, in fact, the belief in vampires ran kind of parallel with the belief in witches and the persecution. It represented two types of monsters in society. They served as a scapegoat for people's misbehavior. But sadly, most of these people who were thought to be witches or vampires were just misunderstood individuals, or perhaps either sick physically or mentally. It essentially was just a sentence to death to anyone who was different from the status quo. It even stretched to Poland, where people were buried without their earthly possessions, and this was a typical indication of a vampiric burial. And in 2013, many bodies were discovered without their heads. Usually in Poland, graves would have jewelry, coins, things that are of value to that person, but a lot of these graves that they found that were of vampiric burials had nothing in them. And they're assessed to be from the 16th century about. So why would people think that a dead body would be a vampire? Where does that come from? Well, there are several things that happen to the human body after death. I'm going to spare you from a lot of it, but let's just say many people long ago would not have understood what was happening to the human body as it began to decay, because they didn't have medicine and they didn't have the capability of understanding during this time. Some of the decomposition process could be misinterpreted, such as the lack of rigor mortis, which caused the limbs to become flexible again, or giving the body a more lifelike feel, bloating of the internal organs as they decompose, or the appearance of a dark fluid, which they might have misinterpreted as blood. Also, the hair growth, I'm going to tell you right now, is a myth. Your hair doesn't grow after you're dead. It's just that the moisture in your skin goes away and the hair appears longer because there's less skin around it. Although the nails, it's the same thing apparently. I googled it. Oh, America, you are not alone when it comes to vampiric burials. In the early years of the United States, consumption was such a large problem that it brought vampires back into play. While witches were a well-known superstition of New America, the effects of consumption, aka tuberculosis, resembled the look of a vampire so closely that they actually thought that people suffering from consumption were actually vampires and buried them as such. And it was as follows. People became pale, they coughed up blood, and they faded away into an eternal sleep. And people were so often accused of being vampires because they spread the sickness to their family, which we all know that tuberculosis is spread through air and droplets. But they didn't during this time, and so they suspected that if you died as a vampire, aka tuberculosis, then your whole family will be a vampire too, or you're gonna come back and get them. Or they would bury you in a skull and crossbones kind of way, assuming that that would stop you from rising from the dead. Cool. You actually also see cages over graves in Europe, although that was more so to just stop it from moving or stop it from opening and stop grave diggers from breaking in, but it could also be interpreted as a vampiric burial. All that being said, researchers all over the world are still unsure why some burials are of a vampiric nature. Why did vampire burials happen to certain individuals when there was no sickness prevalent, such as the man in Lesbos? Disease was not always a factor. Maybe it was a superstition, maybe that person was different from the status quo, or maybe, just maybe, they were vampires. After researching this, my thoughts are that it's inexplicable that every single culture has been touched by vampirism, or just people rising from the death or very unexplained creatures. And for me, when it comes to urban legends having some folklore imprint, it's inexplicable that people would rise from the grave. However, there seems to be this creature that takes from you. And I think that a vampire is an energy thing myself, but I just find it really interesting. Also, Akasha is stunning. So what are your thoughts? Vampires, are they real? How do you see these vampires? Are they blood-sucking? Are they energy? I'd love to know your thoughts. Please put them in the comment section down below. Also, be sure to like and subscribe if you're not already, and ring that bell for notifications. I hope to see you all in the next one. Ooh, this vampire's so spooky.